Good morning, everyone. Today is Monday, and Monday is the time when I invite you to help support the mission of the Masters. Money Monday, we call it. We're doing beautifully well, but projects always expand and resources make more things possible. So if you would like to become a Patreon regular subscriber, Patreon is this wonderful website where creative people can put forward what they're doing, and those who would like to support them can do so. So you can go to Patreon, and you can also donate directly by going to Asha's website, which is called ashajoy.org. And everything that you donate is used to help the mission of the Masters in one way or another. And we are profoundly grateful. I also encourage you, if you're not already a subscriber to my YouTube channel, that if you do that, you will receive notices every time anything is posted, which is quite often, and hopefully you will enjoy that. I'm going to just put in a plug for the biography I wrote about Swami Kriyananda. It's called Light Bearer. It was published we put it out for the 50th anniversary of Ananda in 2019. It's the culmination of my entire life of experience with Swami, year by year, 45 years. It's available through Crystal Clarity or through Amazon or other book-selling sites. And I also have an audiobook of that. And it really dives deep into the foundations of Ananda and the spirit of Swami Kriyananda and how he made all of this happen. And it's a very good read. I think you'll like it. Many people say the audiobook is the best way. I read it myself, so everything that is described there, I could see it while I was reading it, so it adds a certain dimension to it. So now let us pray, and then we'll start our morning. Heavenly Father, Divine Mother, Friend, Beloved God, Jesus Christ, Babaji Krishna, Lahiri Mahashaya, Swami Sri Yukteswar, Beloved Master Paramhansa Yogananda, Saints of all religions, dearest friend and guide Swami Kriyananda, humbly we bow to you all. Bless us with a constant awareness of your guiding presence. Help us to know every moment of our lives, every thought, action, decision that we make is being guided not just by ego and desire, but by superconscious intuition, inspired by your love. We are your children. We have one ambition in life, to live in accordance with thy loving will. Guide us and bless us. Om. Peace. Amen. All right, my friends, we are in Article 8 of 16 articles in Guidelines for members of the Ananda Sevaka order. This is the Ananda way of life. This section is called Work is Service. And so we're in the middle of the second paragraph. I'll start at the beginning, though, of this paragraph. Expansive service, moreover, in God's name, is much more spiritually regenerating than that constricted service motivated by human feeling, which people commonly offer to the few whom they consider their own. Even those closest to them should be served rather with the thought that through them one is serving God. Even those closest to them should be served rather with the thought that through them one is serving God. There's so much implied in that. Sometimes the economy, just from a wordsmith point of view, the economy of Swami's writing is just actually quite startling. There's a whole section in the early part of The Path in which Swami describes his childhood experiences of going into the light and his relationship to his family. And for decades, since that book was published in the late 70s, I've been quoting those passages. And recently, I went back and I read them again. And I mean, there's just a couple of sentences. But the sentences are just like this doorway into these enormous implications. So it's very easy for people to miss what Swami's intention is, which is, of course, one of the reasons why I've been doing all these dozens and dozens of programs where I just take a sentence of his and then chatter on about it for 30 minutes. Because if one really hears what he said, and there's another aspect of this that Swami has commented about recently. Shanti was talking about Swami's Secrets of Life books, where he's written about almost 20 of them on many different subjects, from meditation to emotional healing, and they're little aphorisms, 31 in each book, so you can have one a day. One sentence, two sentences, on rare occasions 3, but each one is a doorway, and if you take it, you can just go through your whole life with it. She was speaking of it with great enthusiasm, and it reminded me of something that Swami wrote. He said, every single word that he ever wrote, every note that he put into every song, the word he used was absolutely sincere and inspired by his guru. Which means that it's not like he just dashes these things off. It's like he concentrates completely, word by word by word, to make sure it says exactly what he wants it to say, and that he is channeled insofar as he was able, which was extraordinarily so, the thoughts not of himself but of Master. His writing itself exemplifies exactly what he's talking about. Expansive service in God's name. How can I be an instrument of my guru? Not what do I want, what would I prefer. It was very fun many years ago. This would have been probably in the late 70s, maybe in the early 80s. They started making soft contact lenses. Now, of course, all of these things are ordinary now, but I'm old enough to have been there when it started. And when soft contact lenses were first being made, they were like only a few optometrists or ophthalmologists would prescribe them. And we ended up driving from Ananda Village to Marin County, south of San Francisco, because there was and for some reason he was a holistic eye doctor. And so he treated the whole person, not just the eyes. And so as part of the examination to get the contact lenses, we had this like lifestyle survey, and we had to write for the doctor, what we did and why we did it. The whole thing was a little like over the top, but nonetheless, he was a very nice man, and we were able to get these lenses when you couldn't get them elsewhere. And so one of the questions was, what do you do? What's your profession? Swami writes, I write books, I counsel, I write music. And then the question was, what do you like to do? And we sort of, Swami sort of looked at us with this great sort of puzzled look on his face, and he said, write books, counsel people, and write music. It's like, what do you mean, what do I like to do? I just do. Because everything that I do, I feel comes to me as an inspiration from God, and that's what I like. What I like is feeling in harmony with my own intuition, with my superconscious self, with the guidance of my guru. Swamiji talked about, he made this statement in 1990 after he finished writing the book, The Essence of Self-Realization. The first book he wrote from his experiences with Master, from the notebooks that Master had him keep of his experiences with Master, was The Path, and he published that in 1978. And he didn't go back to those notebooks until 1990. Of course, all of that informed everything he did, but literally going back to the notebooks, he went back to it in 1990. And just as it happened, he moved from his own house at Crystal Hermitage into the small guest house because they were doing construction on his house, and he needed quiet. Then, as it happened, the power went out. And so the power was out for like about 5 days when he was writing that book. It was winter. It was the dead of winter. The dead of winter. I guess that means because the trees are dead and so on like that. So normally he would write on a computer, but he had to write this book by hand because the computer wasn't working. And so the way he was doing it, he wrote that book in sections and subject sections. And sometimes he didn't have quite enough material to really fill out the section, or one of the conversations he'd had with Master wasn't quite full enough. And so he would sit quietly and ask Master to guide him. And he said he heard Master's voice in his mind. He would either would hear, additional ideas, or often he would remember. And to be accurate, I think it was mostly that he would remember. He would remember things that Master said, but he would hear Master saying them in his mind, and he would write them down. And he said the interplay between himself and Master was so dynamic that he could say, "You'll have to repeat that. I didn't quite get it all down," or "Please speak a little slower." And then he would hear Master's voice slow down in his mind. And so the loss of the computer, he said, actually turned out to be a great blessing for the writing of that book, because it forced him to be so quietly focused. There was no clacking of the keys, or just there was no external interference. It was entirely inward, and the writing is very different from typing. But after that, he said, Master's thoughts have become my thoughts. He said, I can't tell where Kriyananda ends and Yogananda begins now. He said it's just the melding of their consciousness. I believe it didn't begin with the writing of that book, but Swami felt afterwards to make that statement. Later he said, it's not enough to say thoughts, he said. I don't know where my consciousness ends and Master's begins. My consciousness ends and Master's begins, which is really where we're trying to go. So coming back to what we have here, which is even those who are closest to us. Now, when we have people who are close to us, this is the baby that I gave birth to yesterday at the end of our Sunday morning service. We had a blessing of children. And because COVID has kept us all separated for 1.5 years, the children have accumulated. And also because we haven't done one of these in a long time, many families brought their children. So we had about a dozen families, I think, or maybe not quite that many. But it wasn't just 2 parents and a child. It was grandma and grandpa and aunt and uncle and various others. So we had this marvelous army of people up there, all of them hovering around some smallish being. Some of them were ambulatory and verbal, and a couple of them were just these little tiny little girls being held in their parents' arms. And I was when I was introducing the blessing before we did it, I said, this is a great advertisement for reincarnation, because maybe we'll be fortunate enough to be born into a family of yogis and be brought, even before we can speak, into this temple to receive the touch of light from the masters. I mean, that would be great. And it's simultaneously a tremendous incentive not to have to reincarnate, because there you are. You're smaller than a basketball, and you're just being carried around. The absolute inability to direct your own destiny of a baby it's really pronounced. You can make noise and flap your arms and hope that somebody will respond to you. I was traveling once on an India flight, and it's a 16-hour flight, and it's a real issue, of course, for small children, and somehow we must have been changing planes. And there was this child in a stroller, and he was just flailing about and crying, but he was sort of so tired he could hardly cry. And I just looked at him, and he communicated to me exactly what he was thinking. Somebody please do something. You know, I feel terrible. Somebody do something. And I sort of, you and me both, honey. That's just exactly how I feel a lot of the time, you know, just in life. Somebody do something. But at least I can talk it out and move my body around. And he was just incomprehendingly helpless. So that's the other side of it. One of my friends, who was a very serious yogi, said he'd always, you know, heard that reincarnating wasn't such a great idea. But when his first son was born, most new parents become a little lax in their meditation practice. He said from the moment his first son was born, he had never missed a meditation practice after that, because it was so obvious what the project is once you have a new body and you have to start over. So, but anyway, there we are. We're blessing all these children. It's a beautiful blessing. It's an affirmation by the parents of how they are going to regard this little baby and how they're going to help this child. You know, this is a vow on the part of the parents not to forget that even though I adore you, I would give my life for you, you're absolutely the cutest thing I've ever seen. I can't stop looking at you and, you know, touching your fat little cheeks and tickling your tummy. Another friend of mine who said when his first son was born, he also said, I swore I would not be one of those embarrassing parents, you know, who just is always googling over their little baby and will just, you know, make fools of themselves. He said, went completely out the window. He said, I would do anything to make that baby smile. He said, all sense of personal dignity and restraint was gone and happily thrown out the window. Now, this is the way God makes it, because otherwise it's just too much work. And so that profound love, that profound, specific love is planted in us so that we can have the experience. I talked about that when I was talking about children. But are we serving that soul because you belong to me? Or are we serving that soul because God has sent you to me? And it is my promise to God that I'm keeping in taking care of you. I mean, this is also a really good idea, because the illusion that we possess each other is just exactly that. It's an illusion. And it's bad enough between consenting adults who begin to exercise this proprietary right, which tends to have a very deleterious effect on the quality of the relationship. But it's stunning with children in its potential to destroy the relationship. I have these children, and this is what I expect from them. I've given so much to them. This is what I expect from them. This is the life they should live. This is who they should be. This is how they should treat me. And how many children, well, in Western countries where they can, just simply run away from their parents because of that. And it's tragic. And it's tragic because of this profound misunderstanding. And the child just may not turn out to have any of the qualities that you want them to have. They could turn out even to be, mentally impaired, or just so different in their interests and their inclinations that nothing is there. It's like, who are we trusting? Is this a Vaishya relationship? I give to you a certain amount and then you give back to me. Or is this a Kshatriya relationship where I live because of the ideals that inspire me? and we trust it's God we're serving through this person. And the question is not what do I want, or even what does my child want, but what does God want to have happen here? And when we're always turning our attention upward and inward into the spiritual eye, the inspiration that we receive is going to be far wiser than if we just run with instinct and emotion. And the world is littered with isolated, unhappy children and parents, which is to say, people, because we hung our expectations on human personality instead of trusting God behind the experience. So even those closest to us should be served with the thought that through them, one is serving God. And then also, on the other side, the developmental potential of service in the person doing the serving can become ever expansive. So it's not, I'll serve you as long as I need you, and then I'll go back to my selfishness. And then we'll also have the opportunity to discover that the real joy here is service itself. And then it won't matter so much whether I have this person or that person. This also prepares us for change, because children do not always remain small and dependent. And some children are extremely eager to become completely independent of their parents' care, because they have their own destiny and they want to carry it out. But if we're serving God, God can always show us another way to serve. And our understanding of what we're doing becomes based on principle rather than on personality and specifics. So all work is service, and all work is service to God. Swami then goes on to a completely different thought. The employment sought by members should be in keeping with Ananda ideals and should not be selected from financial motives alone. Above all, it should be approached in the light of the opportunities it affords for serving others in a divine way. I was talking to a friend recently who was considering taking a soul-satisfying job that was going to be far less lucrative than other kinds of work that might be available to them. And I was commenting that, sometimes you can take a pay cut, even a substantial one, for work that you love, because if you love your work, you don't need to spend as much money. A lot of times we spend money because we're feeling the need to indulge ourselves or change the energy, because so many hours of the day are spent doing uncongenial things that we need to treat ourselves, or we become exhausted, or we become rebellious against the oppression, and then we have to go out and do something that costs money, buy stuff, or go to expensive places. But if our everyday life, and work is hours and hours of our day, if our everyday life is satisfying to us, then simpler pleasures are enough. I mean, relaxation and balance is needed, but simpler pleasures are enough. One of the things that happens when you have more money is that you spend more money, and you begin to think in terms of spending more money. I've been very impressed. In the area that I live in, there's a lot of people from many other countries, and some are immigrants in the classic sense of just getting established and having to be very financially conservative and so on. When you go out to the parks, the local parks, on Saturday and Sunday afternoons, there's a lot of big groups having picnics. And I began to realize that almost all the big groups having picnics are relatively recent arrivals into this country. And I'm projecting into it, although it's not always true, that they may not be as financially established, or maybe they're just not in the habit of spending money, just so lavishly. So they go to the park. And they have a picnic, and there's multi-generations there, and the cousins all get to see each other, and I mean, they play games, and they kick the ball around, and children get to be with adults, and every group that I've seen, without exception, they seem to be having a wonderful time, and it's free. Just as simple as that. A friend of mine whose spouse is from Europe, so periodically, even when their children were quite young, they would travel to Europe for a period of time to visit the relatives. And he was joking about, you know, first of all, he's American, you go to Europe with young children, you don't get to do much of what you would do if you didn't have young children. There's also the expense of it. And then the children always come home, and their favorite thing, was perhaps the swimming pool at the hotel, which was really not substantially different from the swimming pool in the hotel at the end of the block where he lives here, you know, or an ice cream cone that they had, or, you know, just something totally unrelated to having gone all the way to Europe. But that's what happens. And we get in our minds, you know, that all of these things are necessary. So he's talking about seek employment that is consistent with your life goals. Now, of course, we can't always have everything we want. So in any case, Swami says, all work should be approached in the opportunity it affords for serving others in a divine way. Serving others is not really popular right now. There's a lot of, part of it's just looking out for ourselves as sort of the dominant consciousness, and we're always protecting our boundaries and not wanting to be taken advantage of and all these things, which are true. But we can also adjust our inner attitude and ask ourselves, instead of what are people doing for me, it's the very simple question, how can I serve? How can I help the people around me? How can I give how can I give love to people? Everybody in this world fights the same battle. Self-worth, loneliness, wanting to be understood, wanting to be appreciated. If you become the person who gives, you can change the atmosphere all the way around you. When I was 18 years old, I matriculated into university. I only lasted 1 year. And it was a 4-year school, and they brought all the freshmen onto the campus a week early so we could get oriented. So for 1 week, it was almost no one but freshmen. All of us pretty much scared to death. I mean, covering it pretty well, but just like, who's going to love me? Who's not going to love me? Am I going to make it here? Will I flunk out? Will I find friends? We had a few upperclassmen who were kind of guiding us. And I perceived what happened in that atmosphere was absolute social gridlock. It's like everybody was so worried about how they were going to be perceived that nobody could move. And after about 2 days, it occurred to me that if I simply pretended that I wasn't as nervous as everyone else, because I was as nervous, but if I pretended I wasn't and acted as if I was at ease and tried to give to other people instead of worrying about what they would give to me, maybe we could break the gridlock. As soon as I started doing that, everything began to change. And interestingly, in that first week, I met the people who were the most important to me that whole year. And I met the one friend who is the one close friend, except for my sister, that I still maintain after all these years, even though she's not part of Ananda, my friend. We're still very close friends. And I met her almost immediately, as soon as I shifted my thought from what can I get to what can I give. So even if in our work we find ourselves in a place that is not ideal or is even uncongenial, experiment. How can I give? Because everything is magnetism. And when we start shifting our magnetism into what we would like to have around us, well, miracles can happen. God bless you.